Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jessica Kennedy, and I'm the educator for adult learning at the St. Louis Art Museum. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's opening lecture about the exhibition Paintings on Stone, Science and the Sacred, 1530 to 1800. Before we begin, please familiarize yourself with the Q&A section located on your screen. Feel free to enter your questions at any time during the program, and we will choose a few to answer at the end. Also, there is live auto transcription available for this program. Please click the CC icon to activate or deactivate the subtitles. For tonight's lecture, Paintings on Stone, Making an Exhibition, we are joined by Judith Mann, the Senior Curator of European Art to 1800. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Judy.
Sorry, couldn't find my mute. So delighted to be here, and I guess I don't have to commend everyone for making it here through the snow, but luckily a virtual program allows for any kind of weather conditions, so that's a good thing. So without further ado now, many of you now probably have already had an opportunity to see the exhibition Paintings on Stone and can appreciate the array before you of what in my mind are some of my perhaps favorites selected from the exhibition. The show was designed initially to be a kind of tell the story of Paintings on Stone, identify the important artists and sort of trace it through from its beginning to its end. But as I worked on the exhibition and identified more and more paintings, I realized that what would be far preferable would be to focus after some preliminary history of how artists use stone, how they employed the stone, because that's eventually what happens. Tonight, I'm going to tell you the story of the exhibition, the germination of the exhibition, and also the germination of the practice of painting on stone that started in the 16th century. So the exhibition really began, or the germ of the idea for the exhibition began at the dinner table of Christian B. Pieper, a longtime, very devoted patron and beloved individual back in 1999 when I and our, at that point, new director, Brent Benjamin, shows you how long this is, were having dinner with him, and he pulled out the Christie's catalog for the upcoming sale that was going to happen in January of 2000. And he had particularly identified this oval painting on lapis lazuli by Cavaliere d'Arpino of Perseus and Andromeda. He came to it not necessarily for the stone and certainly not for the artist, but for the subject. He himself owned a copy after a very famous Rubens painting of the subject. It was a favorite of his. He was an ardent classicist, read many myths in many original languages. And so he was particularly charmed and interested in this and encouraged us to try to get it. I went immediately to New York. I realized what a wonderful painting this is. And although it was going to cost considerably more than the 30 to 60,000 that Christie's had put as its estimate, but we were successful in bidding by phone from St. Louis and secured the painting at the sale. So in purchasing it, and as I pursued it initially, and I'm showing you now just how it was presented in the museum when we first showed it, not much different than see it in the exhibition in its a frame that we now know was added in the 18th century, and we presented it in a case in our galleries with this kind of rich red background. In looking and thinking about this painting, I thought I knew what it reflected. Having worked a great deal on this sort of period in Rome in the late 16th century into the 17th century, very familiar with the refurbishing programs undertaken, starting really with the pontificate of Sixtus V in the 1580s, transforming Rome, sort of returning Rome to the glory of the really Augustus, but certainly the grandeur. Rome had suffered so badly in 1527, the sack of Rome by the troops of Charles V. And there was now a concerted effort to really turn, particularly the older churches, to refurbish them, to make them wonderful again. And this is the burial chapel of Sixtus himself that is in the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore. And so I thought that the painting we were investigating was part and parcel of this taste. And in fact, to Paul V's burial chapel in the same church, where we're looking at the altar wall, and that it's a miraculous icon there in the center. If I put my cursor on it there, and then around it, it actually is a frame and columns that are made from a lapis lazuli kind of facing. So I started, though, doing more research and soon realized that painting on stone wasn't simply a reflection of a taste for stone, but rather it was a thing unto itself. And I was lucky at the point I started really getting into this project, sort of around 2005 or so. By that time, there had been a couple of books, an exhibition, and people had begun to explore this phenomena. And so I knew that it was traced back to Sebastiano del Piombo, seen in the illustration, his portrait that appears in the Vasari's Lives of the Artist. He's identified as Sebastiano Veneziano, and because he was, in fact, from Venice. And he was the one who diligently applied himself to developing what one would think of as a reliable technique or a reliable recipe for paint adhering to stone. Now, Sebastiano, as I said, was a Venetian. He came to Rome at the auspices of Agostino Chigi. Chigi was a wealthy banker, had gone to Venice for several purposes, and he was identifying artists who might work on his kind of pleasure villa on the Tiber. You're looking at the upper left. That is now the Villa Farnesina. It was owned by the Farnese family, but it was at that time Chigi's building, house. And so he hired Sebastiano to paint the fresco that you see there in the center of the Cyclops Polyphemus, who was smitten and fell in love with the nymph Galatea, seen in the very famous painting by Raphael on the right. So in 1511, Chigi brought Sebastiano to Rome for this purpose. Rome that Sebastiano encountered was one in which soon Leonardo da Vinci would arrive, and also Michelangelo with a sizable workshop as well. And you're seeing here the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. I'll get there in a minute, painted by Michelangelo, and also the Raphael and Raphael's workshop. And in fact, we know that a number of Raphael's students and assistants had experimented with using oil paint on stone. So Sebastiano was not the first to do so. And in fact, if you pick up a book that might outline the history of painting on stone, that would inevitably speak about the ancients who used marble, white marble, for paintings. And also periodically in the medieval period, we have examples of artists who painted directly on stone. But I, in this exhibition, isolate the practice as begun by Sebastiano, because it really so perfectly meshed with certain issues and important ideas of the 16th century that I think it is worth seeing it unto itself. And the reasons for Sebastiano's kind of devoted attempt to develop a method, as I called it, a recipe for paint to stick to stone, I think comes out of a lot of issues or a lot of reasons. Certainly, artists at the time were somewhat aware of the ancient practice of painting on stone, but the ancients used white marble. In Italy, artists, except for one painting by the also Venetian artist Titian, they did not use white marble. And so it wasn't really a revival necessarily of that practice. I think it had as much to do with this competitive atmosphere in Rome, every one trying to kind of distinguish himself. Leonardo, when he was there, you might be aware that he himself had experimented somewhat unsuccessfully with oil paint on a stone wall in his Last Supper fresco in Milan. And so I think it had as much to do with sort of reasons of ego in defining himself. A number of people look rather negatively on the production of Sebastiano del Piombo, thinking that had he not aligned himself with Michelangelo early on as he did, and Michelangelo supplied a number of drawings that Sebastiano used for his paintings, that Sebastiano would not have been very much of an artist. I think I somewhat disagree, but it certainly, he was very wedded and attached to Michelangelo for a period of time. And so I think at the time also there was a discussion afoot, primarily, well, Michelangelo and Leonardo were at in this debate as to which was the superior art form. Was it painting or was it sculpture? And one of the qualities that was enumerated for the superiority of sculpture, not the only one, but was its lasting, its eternal quality. And so you might see that you the material of the sculptor and then the color and paint used by painters, you're kind of wedding the best qualities of both. So that might have informed, certainly Sebastiano was aware of that debate, but I think it was more his attempt to distinguish himself, because when he was tasked with the preparation of the wall surface for the painting you're looking at, for the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo, who was a fresco painter. Sebastiano prepared it for painting by oil, or tried to, and alienated, angered Michelangelo, and eventually the two did kind of drift apart. So I think Sebastiano made a very clear statement about his distinguishing himself from Michelangelo. So he used stone. Vasari, in his life of Sebastiano, tells us that he used marble, porphyry, and slate. We only have slate paintings surviving from Sebastiano, two of the most beautiful you're looking at. One, an altarpiece for a chapel in southern Spain, the Ubeda Pietà, and on the right, one of three versions he made of Christ carrying the cross. And Sebastiano, and a number of scholars have written extensively about some of the associations that Sebastiano intended to make by the selection of stone for as the support for his paintings. In the Pietà, for example, one sees the dead Christ, and behind him is his mother Mary. On the left, barely visible, is St. John the Evangelist. Mary holds out the veil of Veronica, but she also, the way it's folded, it resembles the kind of winding cloth that one might employ in the preparation of a body for burial. And in fact, I think Sebastiano is the first, but by no means the only or last artist in the 16th century to utilize the painting of the body of Christ on a piece of stone as a kind of statement about the presence of Christ's body. His body, after he was removed from the cross, he was prepared for burial on a stone that was called the Stone of Unction. And this idea of the body being seen on a piece of stone evokes the real presence of that body. The discussion in the 16th century was rife about the presence of the body in the celebration of the Mass, the ritual celebration of Christ's death, and in culminating in a lot of discussion at the Council of Trent, which ended in 1563. And so there, by painting this quite beautiful and very present body on this piece of stone, I think Sebastiano is intent to refer to that very idea. Whereas on the right, with Christ carrying the cross, by using stone, and you can see it's a close-up view where we're very aware of the tactile qualities of the cross on which Christ will be crucified. He speaks to another aspect of 16th century devotion in the attempt, when he meditates on the events of Christ's life, to think about the materiality of the experience, to think about the way things looked, smelled, and felt. And by putting this on a piece of slate, on stone, you're reminded how heavy the cross would have been. So in both of these cases, and in all of Sebastiano's work, except for an unfinished portrait of the Pope, you're not looking directly at stone, you're looking at a gray background that evokes stone. And that is true of the example we have of Sebastiano's work in the exhibition, because he also used slate for portraits, as a number of artists, as you'll see, did. You think you're looking at gray slate, but in fact, you're looking at gray paint on gray slate. So the material, the stone, it is not for its visual qualities initially that it is adopted, but rather for the ways in which it can inform the meaning of the subject that's represented. The subject here, and we're not absolutely certain as to the identification, could well be Ippolito de' Medici. He was a cousin to Pope Clement VII, who had received under the Pope's auspices several rather lucrative appointments within the church. He himself really wanted the life of a soldier, and he was quite successful in one instance where he led 8,000 or more Hungarian troops against the Ottoman Turks in 1532, a kind of great moment for him. And so this seems
that we have a little bit of a frozen situation here, so give us 1 second. Let me see if I can help Judy out here. Oh, there she is. Yay. She's back. Wonderful.
okay.
All right.
So
So
maybe I will turn off my camera as we.
yes, I think that's probably a good idea. And go ahead and just reshare your PowerPoint.
Okay, so understanding this about Sebastiano, originally, as I was developing the plans for the exhibition, I also knew that a number of artists painted stone altarpieces. Initially, I didn't think that was crucial to this exhibition. We couldn't bring these altarpieces to St. Louis. But after understanding better the way in which Sebastiano was using the stone, I really wanted to understand also, was that true of others? There would be such a thing as stone altarpieces, and could that give us clues as to how they were understood? So I spent a month in Rome looking at such places as the Frangipani Chapel in San Marcello al Corso, and on the left you get an accurate sense of the way it looks. I've included a not very good image of the altarpiece just to show you more clearly what it is about, by Federico Zuccaro, who by 1566 had painted quite a few altarpieces on stone, both in Rome and in Orvieto. Or here you can see another example, which I think makes it quite clear that the making of a stone altarpiece was a rather complicated and expensive undertaking. We're looking on the left at a very poor image of Cristoforo Roncalli's The Fall of Sapphire. It was among a group of altarpieces on stone that were made for St. Peter's in preparation for the Jubilee year of 1600. The conditions in the Basilica of St. Peter's in terms of moisture and humidity were such that the paintings did not fare very well, and ultimately they were all removed, including the Fall of Sapphire, which was moved into Santa Maria delle Angeli, a church built to this designs of Michelangelo elsewhere in Rome. And in this photograph with the raking light, you can see the individual pieces of the stone. And in fact, someone has diagrammed that. And you can see that it was a complicated project employing stone workers and masons to create this. So obviously it was very important that they be of stone, but also it's apparent, as it was in San Marcello, that it's not visual. One is not visually aware of the use of stone. And so during the month I was looking, I had my kind of epiphany moment, kind of confirming what I was understanding about Sebastiano in the Church of Santa Prassede, it was an early church of the 5th century. The building today is large. It was begun or built in the 8th century and then decorated several times thereafter. But in the chapel that I was interested in was the chapel constructed in or decorated in the late 16th century by the Algiati family. And on the right, you're looking as you would walk into the chapel, directly head on is the altarpiece. One sees it a bit better in this image, also by Federico Zuccaro, the same artist we saw in the Frangipani Chapel. And it's an image similar to Sebastiano, Christ carrying the cross. And here, Zuccaro, and it's painted on slate. Zuccaro really emphasizes the idea of the weight. You can see the cross section of the beam, the very heavy beam that Christ shoulders to walk up the hill of Golgotha. He will ultimately go up to the top there where the hill is. And this particular moment, someone from the crowd, Simon of Cyrene, takes pity on him and tries to help him shoulder this enormous burden. When you know it's on slate, when you know it's on stone, one feels the burden as you did with the Sebastiano, and it's a very powerful experience. But what made it even more powerful, if you look at the image on the left, we see the whole chapel wall, and the altarpiece down here at the bottom, but then the vault above the cornice was painted in fresco by Cavaliere d'Arpino, the same artist who created the small lapis lazuli painting that the museum bought in 2000. And in the upper registers of this chapel, after focusing on Christ nearly stumbling under this enormous burden with an altarpiece made of stone, and then you look up to see first his resurrection, where he's freed from a stone sarcophagus and rises up. And then finally, at the very top of the chapel, this sort of frame is stone, but everything inside it is painted, is illusionistic painting. And you see him sort of freed from the earthly realm as he ascends fully into the divine. And when I was there, and sort of as you follow it up and you focus on the stone and then you look at this image of release, it was a kind of physical feeling, this idea of the transcending the earthly realm to enter the divine. And so at that moment, and given what I already knew about Sebastiano, I began to feel very strongly that when artists chose to use stone, it was often with purpose. It was often to enhance meaning. So, well, we can go back. You can notice the dates that Cavaliere d'Arpino was involved in working in the Algiati Chapel, 1592 to 95. And that's during that time, he fashioned the Art Museum's painting of Perseus and Andromeda. We know now that our version is not the first one that that Cavalieri d'Arpino painted, but rather the second. Unfortunately, for the exhibition, we didn't get the loan of the first version, which is in RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design. It was deemed too fragile to travel, but we can look at it and analyze it and recognize that Cavalieri d'Arpino designed this particular subject to be painted on stone. He devised it for a stone surface. The subject concerns Andromeda and her mother, who bragged of their beauty, thus annoying the Nereids, the sort of attendants to the ocean or god of the sea, Poseidon. And Poseidon, in turn, sent a sea monster to ravage the kingdom of Andromeda's father. And the father, to save the kingdom, offered his daughter as a sacrifice. A horrible story in many ways. And that's what you see. And then Perseus happened along, the hero Perseus happened along, saw Andromeda, fell in love with her, was smitten beauty. And then he asked for her hand in marriage from her parents first, and then he went about killing the monster and saving her. So why do we think it was designed to be on a stone surface? Well, the version, those of you who are familiar with myth, various these stories know that they exist in many versions, different recordings of the myth, different sources and evolutions of the stories. And the one that was read most widely in Rome at the time, one well known today, was by the Roman exiled poet Ovid. And in Ovid's account, he describes Perseus when he first put on Andromeda. He thought her to be a marble, so beautiful was she. And the only time he realized that she was not fashioned of stone was when her hair began to sort of ripple in the breeze. And so in this painting on stone, which you don't see any of the stone, you just see paint, we have Andromeda, who sort of is made of stone. She's attached, she's kind of chained to stone. And Perseus arrives, if you see in his left hand, holding the head of Medusa, which was known to turn people to stone. So these various plays on kind of petrification in this painting. So it seems quite clear that the artist really was thinking about painting on stone. He had probably been first exposed in the Olgiati Chapel when he was working with Federico Zuccaro. And then he painted the painting again. And the second version, which is the one here in St. Louis, the one on lapis lazuli, where he made certain changes. And this is a very important comparison because in the RISD version, he covers the stone completely and he creates a composition as he wishes. When he turns to painting it on lapis lazuli, he responds in a certain significant way to the physical properties of the stone. The major difference in the compositions, you can see he's changed the direction of Perseus, but he has changed the position of Andromeda in order to accommodate the crack that existed in this piece of lapis lazuli. It's a nearly 8-inch high piece of lapis, which is quite large. It is not pieced together. There are other lapis paintings in the exhibition. They are all pieced. This is not. So it's quite an extraordinary piece of stone to have to begin with. And then the Cavalieri d'Arpino responded to the physical property of the stone by changing Andromeda's pose. Her weight is now held on her left leg. Her right leg is limp, and that allows her to pull it up so the toes align along the crack, which they would not have done if her right leg was supporting. And he may have even intended another little play where, because of the crack, Andromeda is sort of protected from the sea monster. He'll have to bridge the crack in order to get to her. All of this kind of play with the story would have been very appealing and appreciated by a kind of erudite circle of writers and probably cardinals in the city of Rome. We have no idea who owned this picture, but undoubtedly that would have been the audience for it. So Cavaliere d'Arpino is responding to the stone, and he's using a very beautiful stone that does have visual properties that are worth of showing. And the dating of his painting nearly coincides with this other very important document in the history of painting on stone. And this is a double-sided tabernacle painted by Sigismundo Lehr, a German painter who came to Rome seeking work during this restoration period. And you can see that he painted on the left the Annunciation to Mary, on the right the Ascension of Christ, and excuse me, he painted it on this piece of agate. And he also signed and dated it, Sigismundo Lehr, Rome, 1594. So Lehr, in choosing this piece of agate, slavishly follows the directions of the stone. And that's very apparent here in the Annunciation. So unlike Cavaliere d'Arpino, who's aware and responds to the stone, in the case of Lehr, he allows this kind of natural kind of aura that appears in the agate to encompass the figure of the angel Gabriel, who's coming to announce to Mary that she will be the mother of God, the mother of Jesus. He uses another of these circular sort of areas for the dove of the Holy Spirit, for the figure of God the Father. But the natural configuration of the stone doesn't really allow for quite the starring role in this subject that should be afforded to the Virgin Mary. This is, after all, very important in the church, a feast day for Mary, the Feast of the Annunciation. And she is kind of relegated, not too badly, but still not front and center as she usually is. And so that suggests that Lehr really is responding to the stone. So this is the earliest example we have of an artist fully responding to the visual properties of the stone. And it seems that in Rome during the 1590s, this is a change where artists turn from covering the stone completely. Only occasionally prior to that do we have bare stone. For example, in this portrait where porphyry is used, but it's used to signify the wealth and importance of the individual. This is one of the Medici. It is not used to inspire the composition in any way. So with Cavaliere d'Arpino, we had him painting in sort of two modes, the covering the stone completely and allowing the stone to infuse the image with meaning, and also he responding visually to the properties of the particular piece of stone. And so it's an exciting time in the 1590s in Rome. And we have one thing that I particularly like to point out in this exhibition. We have at this time a time that's usually dominated by the Caravaggio, where everybody's thinking about his introduction of a very stark realism and a very heavily sfumato, heavily shaded use of dark paint in his paintings. But we have also artists using these wonderful stones in very colorful and different kind of ways. And Orazio Gentileschi, of course, is in the immediate circle of Caravaggio. In fact, for those of you who've been around as long as I have, you may remember the exhibition we did of Orazio Gentileschi and his daughter Artemisia. And back then in 2002, when we hosted that exhibition, We knew through documents that Orazio Gentileschi had made small paintings on alabaster. One of the sources described them as small things, diligent and charming. A wonderful description. But no one had ever seen any of these. And yet, in the last 20 years, the three of them have come to light. And nicely, we have all three of them in the exhibition. This Fall of the Rebel Angels, this meditative David in contemplation on a piece of several pieces of lapis lazuli, and what to my mind is one of the glories of the exhibition, this very beautiful Annunciation, also on alabaster. And, you know, very different. You can see I bring the sort of one of the key images of Caravaggio to kind of demonstrate that harsh realism and that use of a kind of penetrating light and shadow that defines the three-dimensionality of the figures and also gives you these very powerful effects of light penetrating darkness. But, and Orazio was very much influenced by Caravaggio, but he also was doing things quite differently. And that shows us that Rome in this time period was a very rich place. It was a lot of creativity going on, and it's not just that of Caravaggio. This painting, as the layer, is on represents the Annunciation, and in this case, it's on alabaster. The layer was on agate, a stone that is translucent. And artists were very aware of these qualities of the stone, and you'll see it in other ways within the exhibition. But it's we can demonstrate, I think, that they were thinking about this idea of light penetrating the stone. In the case of the Annunciation, it's an important idea because at least as early as the 12th century, this idea that the perfect metaphor for Mary maintaining her virginity after giving birth was the passage of light through glass or light through a translucent stone that doesn't break. It passes through the stone, but it doesn't break it. And so putting the Annunciation on a piece of alabaster makes that sort of enhances the meaning of the stone. And we have this marvelous example provided for me by a conservator in Cologne who has been cleaning this particular painting. We don't know the artist. We're not even sure of the specific school. And it's on a very different stone, calcareous sinter, a kind of calcite-like stone, not represented in the exhibition. I only learned of this very late in the game, but she, in her lab, was able to try out putting candlelight behind the painting because she too was convinced that artists were thinking about the translucency. And here you have the martyrdom of St. Lawrence, who was grilled, a horrific way to die. And so you can see that it's a rather monotone composition. The area of the fire is much more colorful. And then when she put a candle behind it, you got this marvelous sense of the flickering of the flames beneath St. Lawrence's body. So we know that artists were thinking in terms of the physical qualities and the translucency of the stone. And they also thought of the kind of symbolic properties of the stone. Already in the Orazio Annunciation, we saw how the alabaster was the clouds that surrounded God the Father. So it's a suggestion that the alabaster can represent the divine or be an image of heaven. And that's made very clear in this painting by the French artist Jacques Stella. He is very well represented in the exhibition. He's really one of the great painters on stone, very creative, very resourceful. And this is a scene that had a certain resurgence in popularity in the 16th and into the 17th century of a scene that it doesn't really, there's no record or biblical account of it, but Christ, after he has risen from the dead, he appears to his mother. And we're seeing in this case, he's shown actually in the heavenly realm with angels surrounding him. And Mary is still in the earthly realm, and she steps up to greet him. And the way the artist has illustrated this for us is Christ is backed by this beautiful alabaster. Mary steps up off slate. He has painted that corner of the composition to look like slate. So it's peeled back the alabaster to reveal the slate below. And it's also true that this particular painting was alabaster backed with slate. So the artist is also making a visual reference to the physical quality of this particular piece, that it is a piece of alabaster that's put onto a piece of slate. So very much aware of these qualities of the stone. So the exhibition chronicles about 270 years. Painting on stone really was most active, or artists were most often doing it in the years between 1530 and 1650. But we do have in the exhibition lovely examples that take us through to the 18th century and almost to the brink of the 19th century. And I illustrate in particular this wonderful still life from the Frick that was painted probably by 1795. We don't have a specific date. This will be the something that I dissect in greater detail at the upcoming symposium in April, but it also takes us to the sort of next chapter of paintings on stone, because really, although I ended it at 1800, there is another chapter that happens in the 19th century I'll talk a little bit about, where artists utilize actual the tabletops to paint on, and sort of a much more material sense of the stone. So that's the kind of next stage. But in the meantime, we can certainly enjoy the really creative, clever, and visually very attractive work that artists did in the 16th and 17th centuries. So thank you. And if anybody has questions, I think we have time, even with our loss of the internet, to entertain them.
Yes, we do have quite a few questions. And Judy, if you wouldn't mind leaving your PowerPoint up just in case we want to refer to it. Well, thank you. And yes, we have quite a few questions. And we're definitely not going to be able to get to all of them, but let me start with, someone has asked, is the conservation of the paintings on stone a particular challenge? Do you know?
Like everything, it really depends on the particular painting. It even in terms of marble is really, I think, one of the easier stones to work with. Less paint sticks quite well to it. Slate can be very difficult depending on the technique and how the painting has been kept. There are lots and lots of slate paintings where there are significant areas of lifting. The paint is lifted off. That speaks to the artist's technique. It also speaks to the quality of the slate. Slate is not slate is not slate. There is slate from outside of Genoa, which is regarded as kind of the better slate. And that seems to have been what was available to artists working in Rome. But there was another group of artists who turned to using slate in the city of Verona after a quarry was started producing there around 1580. And that seems to be a lesser quality slate, and there does seem to be more conservation problems with those paintings.
Thank you. Someone else has asked, so for the paintings where the stone is completely covered over with paint, how would the viewers even know the painting was on stone as opposed to a wood panel or canvas?
Right. Well, there are several people who are doing work on interaction with works of art, and particularly touching. And I think that probably has to be the case that people, we do know that a lot of types of things were touched by devout people. Sometimes the assumption is maybe they were over clean, but I think in some cases paintings were simply rubbed constantly. There is a painting in the exhibition that was owned by the King of Spain, Philip II. And we do have an account of how he had it behind a curtain, and he kneeled very close to it and he pulled the curtain aside and he engaged with the picture. It doesn't say he touched it, but one gets the sense that it was a very close experience. And so I suspect that people touch them.
No longer, but yeah.
Yes, right.
Right.
Don't get any ideas.
Right. Absolutely. All right, let's see. You mentioned early in your presentation that Sebastiano's images of Christ on stone might have been a nod to the stone tomb in which Christ was buried. Are there any examples of paintings that depict directly the body in the tomb? I assume they mean paintings on stone that depict the body in the tomb. The Eucharistic imagery certainly seems pertinent to the times, but I'm curious as to how directly you think these pieces insinuated that perceived reality.
There are. We don't have. We have the one by Cantarini in the exhibition, which behind the Virgin, who is sort of holding the dead Christ in her lap, there is the empty tomb with the lid painted, very kind of reduced to almost just blocks of stone, which makes a very clear reference, in my view, to that idea. We do have. I don't know if we have any entombments per se, but we do have Christ prepared for burial, and we do have several with the very clear tomb in the background with the lid of the sarcophagus, which could have served as the stone of unction.
Let's see. Someone else has asked, so classical Greek sculpture was painted, correct? Was that technology of painting on stone sculpture available to Renaissance artists?
We have this idea that the Renaissance didn't paint sculpture, but it did paint much. They also introduced the idea of white marble Greek sculpture because a lot of it had lost its paint. But those artists also painted a lot on stone sculpture. So yes, they had that those recipes, that technique.
This is a more technical question. Someone wants to know, how much do these artworks weigh and how are they hung? And if God forbid there was an earthquake, would they be okay?
We are very careful in that. Many of them have little ledges underneath them. You don't see it because the shadow of the frame. But we assure you that every attempt was made to include far more support than needed. The weight varies. I mean, some of them are very thin. The slate paintings, many of these are either in situations where we can't open them, so we don't always know what the thickness is. Also, some of them have multiple slate backings. Probably when they were broken, slate was added. Some of them had slate originally as a reinforcing support, and then slate was added. I do know there's one painting in the show that has 3 pieces of slate behind it. So that obviously would increase the weight. The large slate painting in the second gallery is very thick and very, very heavy. So is the large piece of marble, which depicts the interior of the Charles Borromeus Church. But there's a fairly large painting of Bacchus and Ceres and Venus in the last gallery. It's slate and it has nothing behind it. It's just this piece of about 1/4 inch slate. And in fact, the owner of it doesn't like to display it in a frame. He displays it just with bare, he hangs it with little clips and not a frame. So we felt very nervous about that. We didn't want to do that.
but I will say, since I was able to actually see the show and I know the piece you're talking about, it was really nice to be able to see that, just to see the thickness of it.
Mhm.
It really makes a difference. So.
Mhm. Mhm.
So we have several folks here, and you may have mentioned this, but really wondering about the, how if the oil was treated before application, kind of like what was that recipe that made it so that the painting would adhere to the stone? Were there special, that
Mm.
special recipe, I guess. So we
Well,
have an answer.
heating was part of it. Also quality of materials, as always. The If you read the essay in the catalog, then the first layer of paint was applied, really rubbed in carefully. In fact, we had unfortunately a painting that was not approved for loan, where you could actually see the palm print of the artist who had worked that paint into the stone to sort of make, then, sort of absorbed a bit into the stone to make the paint stick. But I think the term recipe is a good one because, it's just like you can make your grandmother's chocolate chip cookies and they don't necessarily taste exactly alike because maybe there's some little step she did, or she did it a little, stirred it longer or whatever. And it's sort of that way with painting. And so Sebastiano had a good technique, obviously.
Someone else, did patrons specifically ask for pieces on stone, or were these something that the artist brought to the table, so to speak?
We don't know. Most of these being sort of small works for private use. There aren't we don't have contracts in general. We don't have a lot of documentation. So we are not clear. I mean, I'm imagining, for example, in the case of the Cavaliere, the piece the art museum bought, the Cavaliere d'Arpino on lapis lazuli, that was probably a very, very expensive piece of lapis. So probably the artist didn't just make it on spec. I mean, during this time, artists are selling their works by doing shows, having shows in Rome in the Pantheon, Porch of the Pantheon. They would have exhibitions in hopes of selling. But I don't think that was the case here. Some of these, though, probably, Cavaliere d'Arpino making that same image over and over again. It seems like he probably knew it was popular, so he made it on spec and then was able to sell them. But we don't always know whose decision it was. Was it the patron who had the opportunity to have this stone? Or was it the artist who had access to the stone and then suggested? But it so beautifully enhances the meaning and the I will say that for the Medici works, particularly those two pieces of porphyry, I think that was the Medici family had the porphyry and asked that it be used in those portraits. So.
Right, they had the money for that. All right, well, I think this is going to be probably our last question, depending on how many more come through here. So congratulations, very excited to see the show. I was wondering if Andrea Montagna's trompe-l'oeil paintings had a place in this tradition. Would these later artists have been inspired by those paintings? Sorry, I probably just butchered that name.
So I guess you're thinking of the image of Christ on that we see sort of from the feet. Is that what your questioner is asking? So that idea of the body of Christ sort of stretched out on a piece of stone. I don't know. I mean, certainly there's nothing that's that composition, but it is the same idea a bit earlier, obviously with Mantegna. But that's an interesting question. Yeah.
And I don't know, he hasn't clarified, but probably. Okay, and let's see. Someone has requested to see you again before the end. So go ahead and turn your camera on so we can end with your face. We'd love to, and thank you.
Yes.
Thank you again, everyone, for hanging in there.
Okay, yeah, very
They-
sorry to have our little everything had gone so smoothly that we should not have expected it to continue, but
Yeah, that's okay. It happens. So thank you to everyone. Thank you so much, Judy. And it's been wonderful to hear about your work on this show. And I really hope that everyone gets the chance to come and see the exhibition more than once, I would recommend. There's so much to look at. And as Judy mentioned earlier, if you'd like to take a deeper dive into the topic, we will be having a virtual symposium on Thursday, April 7th and Friday, April 8th. It'll be during the day. Registration for that is not quite open yet, but it'll be open later in March. So if that's something that interests you, be on the lookout for that. And then of course we have all kinds of other programs coming up. So just go ahead and check slam.org/events to register for those. And I think that is the end. So thank you so much, Judy. And
thank you. Thanks
And
everybody for tuning in.
we'll see you at the show.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Okay, ciao.